very happy to welcome Paul Statham, who is Professor of Migration and Director of the Sussex Center for Migration Research in the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. He's a political scientist and is Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and is generously doing a workshop today on publishing in that journal, correct?
Well,
publishing in general.
Some tips on how. Roger asked me to do something on tips on how to get published.
And that's at 4 p.m.
Doesn't necessarily mean I'm more successful at it than anybody else.
But he really knows a lot. 4 p.m. in Haines, 279. Yeah. He's authored many publications, including the books Contested Citizenship, The Making of European Public Sphere, The Politicization of Europe. And today he's speaking to us about Europe's quote-unquote problems. Oh, with her Muslims. Her. Okay. Welcome. Thank you.
I'm actually at the CUNY Grad Center for 5 months in New York, so it's great to get the chance to come over and talk to people. I'm afraid today's talk is going to be quite Eurocentric. I've just met with some of the students, and we can talk about to what degree it's possible to think about similarities and difference with the US and European situation, maybe towards the end and in the discussion. But the main point of my talk today is to try and bring out some of the core differences about the way that different European states, particularly the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, which would be the big four in terms of size of Muslim minority populations, and also the four countries with quite distinct ways of and policy approaches towards this, have dealt with these kind of issues. And however accommodating they've been, or however much they've tried to push religion out of the public domain, none of them seem to have either come up with a successful remedy, or trying to be accommodating hasn't made the issue or the problem disappear. So first of all, I want then to focus and talk about contested boundaries over Muslims. And when we talk about Europe, I really want you to think of it as being old Europe. And as I said to some of the students, crusty old Europe with deeply embedded national identities of thinking that it invented liberal democracy and established the pattern of the world that has subsequently been inherited. So, however true this may or may not be, it's certainly how these societies think of themselves, which is very different from societies such as the US and Canada, whose are immigrant societies, and being an immigrant is a sort of a legitimating part of those national identities, of course contested, and of course we live in a period of problems. So I wanted to say that I think there is a certain distinctiveness in the European experience of this that isn't necessarily easily translated across to North America, although that is what some people actually do. So we're talking about established liberal democratic states in old Europe, and basically we're talking about large waves of post-war labor migration from the 1950s from outside Europe that was post-colonial in the context of the UK, France, and the Netherlands, and large waves of guest workers in Germany, and also, again, the Netherlands, which has both types. So we're really talking about the period of post-industrialization and large waves of migrants who'd come from very poor areas in Turkey or Pakistan to the UK, to Germany, to the Netherlands, or from the Maghreb to go to France. And then post-industrialization, we have large groups of minorities of migrant origin who've come from predominantly Muslim countries. And then there's whole issues about rise about the way that states try to deal with this from their different perspectives on church-state relations and integration policies of how to try and do these things. Okay. Today, even within Europe, we talk about super diversity, which is probably the case in London and some of the metropolitan centres, but it's still not the case in many other parts. But cultural and religious diversity matters, and controversies over multiculturalism and Islam in the West are the strong boundaries of demarcation over all issues of integration and immigration in the European context. So when we talk about multiculturalism in Europe, for the large part, it's very seldom talking about all kinds of different ethnic groups. It's usually increasingly in recent years come to be talking about the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. So this strong demarcation. And the question of integrating and accommodating cultural diversity with these old democratic liberal states who've got their strong national imprints of belonging and ways of doing things. And also in the European context, it's important to remember that the minorities we're talking about are almost permanent minorities of about 8%, something like that, in most of the countries, yeah? So that also means that there's limits to which democratic politics, when they're the permanent majority, can actually serve their needs or cultural demands, yeah? Quite often in the European context, it's been the state that has stepped in to do this, and in fact been liberal norms that have counteracted ethnocentrism to try and extend the set of religious group rights that are given to minorities. So the questions then, how do liberal democratic states live up to their liberal norms and constitutional obligations with regard to ensuring equality for cultural, ethnic and religious minorities that result from post-war migration? And these are, of course, highly contested. They're contested. There's lots of disputes about headscarves and everything else at different levels in society. The legal and constitutional systems, so to what extent do laws allow religious group rights? At the level of integration policies, as they're called. So countries in Europe have had different approaches to try and integrate minorities. And how do these work out? As I mentioned, majoritarian politics has this inbuilt populist majority bias, if you like. Public representation, so there's loads of disputes about this in the media and also between civil society organizations. Now, when I come to presenting the data today, what I'm interested in is that most of the research has been on the conflicts and controversies over group rights that occur at all these different levels. And what I'm particularly interested in are people, ordinary people. So given that all this is going on in society, how from an institutional opportunity structure approach do people actually engage with each other? Yeah? So what do they think about giving, what do people from the majority think about the extension of group rights in different countries, and to what extent can that potentially be seen as a problem? Now, I presented all this as an extremely broad sweeping background to what I'm going to say, because I realized that what I'm talking about is actually a Eurocentric story, and it might not actually transfer that well over here. So now I'm going to move to talk more directly about the talk that I want to do and give a bit more specific detail on some of the issues that I've been talking about. Now, societies in Western Europe are transforming through migration and its consequences. Now, increasing cultural diversity is a social fact on the street, so it's what people see around them. And the political question of how liberal states should manage increasing cultural and religious diversity fairly has been one of the most salient and controversial topics for policy and academic debates. So, there is an awful lot written about this, yeah? And you see it not only in academic debates, but in media debates and policy discussion. And in the European context, liberal states' attempt to accommodate Islam as a minority immigrant religion has been the central feature of so-called multicultural controversies. And this isn't just a claim, this is backed up by factual analysis. For example, something I did 10 years ago with a group of colleagues on looking at multicultural controversies and by different ethnic groups, and you don't find much about Rastafarians, you don't find much about claims for group rights in the name of black minorities. You find some in the UK, but not in other countries. And basically, everything really is about Islam, yeah? Now, if we think about some background then on some of the existing research on Muslim incorporation or integration, most research on cross-national variations of European approaches to legal and institutional policy incorporation of Islam. So most of the research has actually been on what states do and what policies do, yeah? And it's been assumed from that whether there's a controversy. So it's been looking at controversies at the institutional level. With regard to group rights for Muslims, there's been a philosophical focus on the so-called multicultural debates. We have the same stuff on cultural clashes and that, all the Huntington type things that you have over here. But in the European context, the multicultural debates have focused on the degree to which different variants of liberalism in Europe can accommodate Islam or not. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that if you think about the origin of the multicultural debates, they were really about something else, about the rights of native minorities in their countries of origin and that kind of thing. It wasn't really supposed to be a philosophical debate about the rights of minorities of migrant origin who were religiously different. But in the UK, it's been focused on that. There's also been work with an empirical focus on the different variants of church-state policies for extending religious group rights and the resultant controversies about headscarves, classes in school, all these kind of things. Christian Jopke has done a lot of work on that kind of thing. And also, there's also been work on the field of public debates, so empirically what is happening in the media discourses. So when we talk here about the institutional context and church policies, so that's one side, if you like, about the institutional response and controversies that resonate there. Here, talking about public debates, again, public debates in the mass media are largely dominated by elite actors making claims either one way or the other that used are as a basis for legitimating or contesting what the actual policy approach is. Yeah. So in a sense, if you take these two things together, they're the context. They represent the context for the controversies that are there, and the mass media are what individuals in a specific society interact with, and they're the source of information that allows them to take positions on. So what I'm going to do in the research I present today is to talk about ordinary people. A little bit more on some of the debates, multiculturalism, religion and Islam integration, multiculturalism and group rights. As I said, multiculturalism has been an important source of legitimating debate over Islamic religious rights demands in Europe, although multicultural debates are often about many different types of group rights. Yeah? Another field where that is relevant is the one on religion. Yeah? And if you think about multiculturalism, then religion might be a more resilient form of identification that's harder to adapt, because while there are policies about discrimination in the UK, for example, that are on the racial basis, like in the US, so that if groups define themselves as black, wherever they come from, they're more likely to get rights, yeah? And so the whole organizational civil society shifts to benefit in forms of adaptation. That for religion, all liberal states have freedom of religion, so people are less likely to give up religion as a form of identification. And then related to this is the question of Islam. Is Islam different from other minority religions? Well, yes, it quite obviously is. It's different than Buddhism, it's different than Sikhism, it's different from Judaism. But in this context, what matters is the extent to which Islam as a religion placed demands on individuals for how they behave in a society. So the fact that Islam can require public calls to prayer, or it can require certain kinds of practices that are performed in public, become visible and rub up against society, whereas other religions, such as Hinduism can be practiced in the private domain, in the home, just like, and fit much more easily there. So Islam has been a much more obtrusive religion on the public landscape and has therefore provoked more reactions. And then with regard to integration, most of these sort of issues can be understood or framed around the idea of, is religion a bridge or a barrier to integration, the classic Foner and Alba way of looking at it. So does being a Muslim and having those kind of psychological and institutional frameworks of support help you better to be part of a society and community, or has Islam become a barrier to being part of society? And in the European context, it's more or less assumed that as I said, there's this very strong, bright boundary, and it's quite often seen as a barrier. Now, I want to take a step back and say a few things about group rights, because multiculturalism is quite often presented to talk about all kinds of cultural diversity in the most loose way. Now, what I'm talking about here are more group differentiated rights. So what do I mean by this? Well, group rights for minorities exhibit two features. First, if granted, the group right goes beyond the individual set of common civil and political rights of individual citizenship that are protected in all liberal democracies. And that means, second, that if it's realized, a group right constitutes the recognition and accommodation by the state of the distinctive identity and need of the minority group. So we're not talking about any form of individual demand made in the name of ethnicity and religion. We're talking about special group requirements and the extent to which the state recognizes those as being above what's already available as an individual citizen. A few words then on the relationship between the debates on multiculturalism and Islam in the European context. Well, problems are seen to arise from increasing demands by migrant minorities for special group rights, recognition and exemption from duties, and state support for cultural identities. So these are the classic clashes over multiculturalism, where advocates of multiculturalism see minority group demands as challenging a unified, undifferentiated citizenship, and thereby offering a liberating alternative to the prevalent white cultural hegemony. Whereas opponents, I think Huntington and other people, see the accommodation of group rights as a challenge to the shared communal values and solidarity that support cohesion and integration. Yeah. So those kind of arguments are used for all debates about multiculturalism, so claims for ethnicity, for gender, for all kinds of group rights. Now the question here is Islam really the same as other demands for group rights, or does the public nature of religion that I've talked about make it something that's specific and more resilient, if you like, as a form of identification and belief? Now, like, the pro-multiculturalists who discuss this in the European context, some just say that claims in the name of Islam, like Tariq Madood, for example, whose version of multiculturalism is actually very British. It's almost like British imperialism sometimes. But it's, for him, Islam is just another claim, yeah? So he says things that Sharia courts, and he's not too worried about the impact on gender of some of these things, gender equality, and he says things such as, taking several wives is the same as men getting divorced and having their wives in series and things like that. He's actually says these kind of things. So for him, there isn't really anything distinctive about Islam that would make it different as a sort of group right. There are other people such as Tariq Ramadan, who's this kind of guru in Switzerland and writes about Europe and Islam. And he says that Islam is different because it's a very special kind of religion. But then if you take someone like Charles Taylor or other pro-multiculturalists, they exclude Islam from multiculturalism precisely because it is a religion that does not recognize other group rights on an equal basis. So that, for example, gender or that kind of thing. So there is I just wanted to flag up that, although multiculturalism has become all about Islam in the UK, in the European context, there is also an internal debate about whether Islam actually fits into that. And I guess what we're talking about really is that religion matters, you know, and so the question becomes, how does religion matter? Religion's often subsumed under the general issue of cultural differences and states' policies for integration. However, it's also a distinct policy field. All liberal states uphold freedom of religion at the individual level, and so they make few efforts to convert migrants away from their religious beliefs, which are seen as a matter of individual conscience. So, you know, you don't have a state policy in the various countries that try and dissuade people from being Muslims or any other faith, yeah? Religion also matters as a context. Although European societies see themselves as secular, Christian religions often play important institutional, social and political roles, regardless of how many people actually go to church or anything like that. You know, for example, in the UK, there are 20 Anglican bishops in the House of Lords, which is the second house. Yeah? When the parliament is opened in the Netherlands, it's blessed by the leaders of all the religions. Yeah? And so these institutional arrangements define the context and political environment into which migrant religions have to find a space. You know, the Queen in England is the head of state and the head of religion. Yeah? So people who come from Muslim countries and take the citizenship test have to swear allegiance to the head of the Christian religion. Now, if you look at it from the individual side, religion also has a bottom-up component. Religious identification is a belief system that can shape people's core identity and values and shape behavior. Yeah? So the question here is Islam as an identity belief more resilient and more obtrusive than other forms of minority identities? And I guess that the importance of religion is also likely to be enhanced for minorities who often live detached from core public institutions that promote civic values, and that therefore, you know, obviously there are also transnational Islamic organizations and groups and networks that can provide a sort of community support system that counteracts what they may be missing from the state of the society of settlement. Now, the nature of religion and demands it makes on followers' way of life is likely to influence the adaptability or resilience of migrant culture vis-a-vis the dominant culture. And as I said before, Islam is a public religion that places demands on followers that, you know, and this brings it into engagement with the state and the receiving society in sometimes a conflictual way. So, for example, the demand, I am a teacher in a public school, but I'm a Muslim, so therefore I want to wear my headscarf when I give class. Yeah, then that because it's part of my religion. Well, there's nothing in Islamic scripts that say that it is or it isn't. If you look at that, that's not really the point. The point is that it's a claim that's made, and how can this claim be accommodated or not? Well, in France, you would be thrown out of the school and not allowed to do it. In the Netherlands and the UK, you are allowed to do that, even though the state, we're talking about state institutions. So then, yeah, to kind of bring this argument together then, Islam is perceived as a barrier to Muslim integration. Some argue Islam is a barrier and source of conflict because European state institutions and national identities remain importantly anchored in Christianity and do not make an equal space for Islam as a religion. So the point here is that however neutral liberal states may present them as being, they're actually built within a culture of Christian belonging. Yeah? And Charles Taylor, the famous multiculturalist, makes this point. He says, many Muslims are well aware Western liberalism is not so much an expression of the secular post-religious outlook that happens to be popular among liberal intellectuals as a more organic outgrowth of Christianity. So if liberalism bears the imprint of Christianity, to what space does that leave for Islam? Now, another thing is that, you know, some people, like for example Christian Jopke, argue that, as I said earlier, popular democratic politics is unlikely to be able to provide for Islam. Some say that the state, the liberal state, steps in and because of constitutional principles, therefore extends group rights to Muslims to provide some form of equality, but the different states do this in different ways. So some argue that liberal nation states have importantly expanded group rights to Muslims because their legal and constitutional institutions uphold liberalism, and they uphold this quite often in the face of public opposition from the majority society. Yeah? And the legitimating thing is that liberal norms cannot operate unchallenged on an ethnocentric basis. For example, Christian Yopka and John Torpey say public sentiment should not be confused with public institutions. Yeah? So it's a high barrier at the level of public imagination, but not in public institutions. Religion, particularly Islam, may still be more a barrier than bridge to including immigrants in Europe, but only as a matter of mentalities, not of institutions. So he's basically saying there's a difference between the public domain and the way that people think about these things, or they're represented in the media, and what institutions actually do. So there's a kind of a two-level game where at the institutional level group rights are given by the state to Muslims, and then there's all this sort of symbolic politics type of debate saying that shouldn't happen at another level. That's also contested. So just to summarize the debate before I really zoom in on the particular paper, really been talking about bright boundaries over Islam between Muslims and majorities in Europe. So Islam has become the key site for the demarcation of boundaries between majorities and migrants across Western Europe. Issues around perceived and real problems of integration of Muslims and accommodating Islam as a religion have resonated fiercely in public debates. In contrast to the US, European debates on so-called failures of multiculturalism refer almost implicitly, I could actually say explicitly, to accommodating the religious difference of Islam. And so there's been this kind of endless series of political controversies over teachers wearing headscarves, mosque building, public funding of Islamic school, and real or perceived incidents of Islamic fundamentalism and resonating in the mass media. And one of the effects is that this actually quite narrow debate about religious rights spills over onto other issues. So therefore, the so-called refugee crisis becomes framed as an issue about Islam, the threat of Islam, that kind of thing. The whole war on terror, everything becomes framed in this way that is somehow detached from maybe the factual situation of the problems or non-problems of social integration. Yeah? Now, the point of this is that it enforces a strong demarcation along religious differences between Muslims and non-Muslims in the public imagination. And this can impact on the way that people interact with each other. All these things that social science tells us that people should do, like bridge in social capital with people outside their group to ensure cohesion, or identify them, or speak languages, or intermarry, all these kind of things. Yeah? And so, boundary drawing demarcation. Islam is a strong, bright and resilient boundary in the public domain. So the question that I'm going to zoom into now is, how does this impact on ordinary people, Muslims and majorities, their views, interactions and life chances? There's been virtually no research on how institutional accommodation mediated by political controversies relates to views of ordinary people. Yeah? Now, there are very strong cross-national variations in the degree and form of accommodation of Islam. We can refer to these as opportunity structures at the policy level, and there's very strong variations in the public debates. So that, if you like, is the contextual thing. And so what I want to do, I show some of that as context, and then switch to looking at how this relates to the cultural distance or boundaries between ordinary people from majority and Muslim populations over these issues of religious group rights. Now, the study is strictly comparative, based on a systematic data set, and it's a study of the Netherlands, the UK, France and Germany, who are the countries with the most sizable populations of immigrant origin and have distinct and very distinctive approaches for extending group rights to Muslims. So this paper examines religious group rights for Muslims in the 4 countries, as I just said. And the research is one of the first to address important questions over the controversies by recourse to original empirical evidence on public debates and public opinions within a cross-national framework. we actually live in quite a strong deficit of empirical evidence on these issues. The debates about, if you look at academic, I'm a journal editor, if you look at academic articles, there are very many normative arguments and articles and positions about multiculturalism and Islam and what should be Islamophobia, all these kind of things. But with regard to looking at everyday lives or even simply what people think, there's quite a strong deficit of information. So, first, what the paper does, it assesses the degree and form of contestation over group rights for Muslims between political actors in the national public debates carried by the mass media. So these, if you like, are the elite debates that relate to the policy frameworks in the different countries and take up different positions, give different indicators for positions and controversies over the issue. I'm only going to talk very briefly about these. I'm not going to give you the analysis, just the findings, because if you like, this is the context, this is the information that's out in the public domain for people to interact with when taking their positions on these issues. And two, I want to examine, and this is what I really want to do here, examine the gaps between Muslims and non-Muslims over group rights issues to see whether they indicate a position, potential for controversy. Yeah. So is the gap real? Yeah. And cross-national comparison, this also allows some degree of insight into whether public opinion follows or contradicts the distinct imprints of the four countries' policy approaches. For example, the Netherlands and the UK are more accommodating, so does that mean that people in that society take a less oppositional view, or are the things not related at all? Because again, we don't know much about the interaction of these kind of things. So today I'm focusing on people's opinions on extending group rights to Muslims. And of course, I have to say this as a sort of proviso, when we're talking about Muslims as a single category, this covers a highly heterogeneous group of people from different Islamic faiths, countries of origins and generations. And in a sense, using Muslim all the time is already a construction that indicates the problematic that we're actually trying to study, because grouping all these people together as Muslims, although in Germany you're talking about Turks, UK Pakistanis, Netherlands Turks and Moroccans, it's basically it's almost one of the problems with survey research is that Muslims are exoticized and constructed as the other, and then the questions that are asked are usually about gender equality, positions on homosexuality, and those kind of issues. So there's this kind of othering that goes on that then gets then is also almost public debate and academic debate come reinforcing. So one of the thoughts behind the type of research I'm doing is to try and for all its limitations, sensitize some of these discussions by, including different definitions of Muslims. You'll see that when I come to the method. Now, first of all, I'm not sure what the level of knowledge here, so I need to give you a kind of whistle-stop tour through the different policy positions in the four countries on church-state relations, as these are the opportunity structures for accommodating Islam. Now, France, in the classic case of laïcité, is the archetypal secularist case. Laïcité to French people is almost like a religion of secularism. Yeah? State-church separation that provides little space for any religion in public life and institutions. The French state is resistant to the idea of separate institutions such as schools for religious groups and displays of religiosity in public environments. And that doesn't just apply for minority religions, it also applies for majority religions. So all religion, in a sense, is treated differently and kept out of the public domain. Now, the Netherlands comes from a very different tradition, which is the non-interference of state in religious self-governance, which is broadly defined to include religious schools, hospitals, cultural and welfare institutions. And the compromise between church and state in the Netherlands turned out to entail full state funding on an equal basis for all denominations. So that, in a sense, created a set of rights for Muslims to claim. Yeah, you could get access to group rights. So my Dutch, you talk about verzwolingen, my Dutch isn't brilliant, but that means kind of pillarization. So my Dutch friends went to either Protestant or Catholic schools, sports clubs, hospitals. Society was structured in this vertical way, and they used to talk, when Islam and minority religions came, it talked about adding another pillar in the polder, as they used to call it in the Netherlands, which probably sounded better in Dutch than it did in English. But the Dutch were very pleased with saying that. In the UK, there's the official state Christian church, the Church of England, led by the Queen as the head of state, that privileges this church over others, also the Church of Scotland. And a sort of pragmatic form of accommodation has proceeded, with the state relatively willing to grant rights to newer religions, often supported by a paternalistic, or in some cases you could argue patronising, Church of England. So basically in the UK the idea was to avoid conflict, we should give group rights, but the hierarchy remains with the Church of England at the top. As I said, we have bishops in the second chamber and that kind of thing, which is unelected anyway. In Germany, state recognition is extended to several religious dominations, including Jewish ones. However, crucially, the German state has so far not been willing to extend the public corporation status to Islam. So this kind of creates expectations for extending religious group rights to Muslims. Yeah? The Dutch group-based pluralism on this pillarization system allows a greater and relatively equal recognition of minority religions. The British's relative openness and accommodation is more elite-led and top-down, and importantly, it retains the Church of England's position at the top of the hierarchy, but they've been, if you like, the key actor in requesting extension of rights to Muslims. In Germany, there are high formal barriers to state recognition as a minority religion, and Muslims tend to have low political influence because it's been very difficult for Turks, for example, to access citizens. So, for example, in Germany, if you pay church tax, that you have to, I discovered this, I worked in Germany, you have to opt out of it to pay church tax, so that if you're Catholic or Protestant, quite often your money just goes to those churches. Muslims don't have the right to do that, even though there are a large number of Turks in Germany. In France, yeah, it's very clear, very high barriers to rights for religious minorities. So even Christian churches are denied the many privileges in the context of state secularism. Then thinking about cross-national differences, if you like, you have 4 different models or opportunity structures for making demands for Muslim group rights. The Netherlands and the UK church state policy traditions have been more open and accommodating to Islam as a new minority religion relative to France and Germany. But, and this is also important, the Netherlands and France tend to treat all religions the same, the Netherlands being very open to them. As I said, everybody blesses the parliament before it opens, this quite important symbolic thing. Whereas in France, it's very restrictive to all forms of religious identification, so you don't get crucifixes in hospitals or anything like that, yeah? Now, whereas the UK and Germany privilege Christian over other religions, and especially in relation to Islam. I'm not going to talk too much about this because of time, but there has, using indicator scoring, people in Berlin have studied the extent to which these group rights are extended at the policy level, with +1 being the highest, minus being the lowest. And then it just shows that they come out with the Netherlands and the Britain as being accommodating, France obviously the least accommodating, and Germany not particularly accommodating. So now I want to talk about the findings on the mass media debates, because we did a study of 10,000 newspapers across the 4 countries to look at what was going on in these public debates there. Yeah. So today I'm just using that as context to saying this is the source of information that people in the different countries have. So what are the key differences that you're seeing in there? First, talking about issue substance very briefly, it was quite interesting to find that in the more accommodating countries, the Netherlands and the UK, controversies don't disappear over group rights, but they shift onto issues of stronger Islamic religious demands. So, for example, where in France and Germany it's all about headscarves, in the Netherlands and the UK it's still there, but it's more about burqas or wearing full dress and that kind of thing. Briefly then, what forms of contestation, what are the forms of contestation that you find between elite actors represented in media debates? Well, the Netherlands is quite interesting because state actors and civil society actors are in favor of extensions of Muslim group rights, but within party politics there's extreme competition, and a lot of negative claims are made, and we call it the Wilders effect because that's of Geert Wilders' Freedom Party. He announced his electoral campaign a couple of weeks ago by describing Moroccans as scum. He thinks that headscarves should be banned in the public domain because they pollute the environment, and he wants a full ban on Muslim immigration. You may have heard something similar about that somewhere else. And so what's happened in the Netherlands is in this accommodating framework, there's been an actor who's mobilized directly over anti-Islamic agenda, and that's had an effect in party politics, though the state and civil society overwhelmingly stay in favor. In the UK, you don't have the Wilders effect, and you have an extremely pacified and supportive public debate where the state, the parties, and civil society and Muslims themselves are all in favor of an extension of group rights. Remember, these are elite-level debates. In Germany, there's a division between the state and civil society on one side, and Muslims on the other for expanding it, so that's kind of a gap between the two sides of society. And in France, in a context where there are very few group rights for Muslims, there is a kind of support from state and civil society for extending them a little bit more. So that's all the context. Thanks for staying with me so far. I imagine it might have been quite difficult. So the question is, how do these distinct state approaches to accommodating religious group rights for Muslims, backed by these legitimating elite public debates, how do they shape how ordinary people, view these issues in the respective countries? So what I'm doing then is studying the gaps between majority and Muslims over these issues. And this gives an idea for the distance between the groups and the relative acceptance. A few features of the survey. One important one is that we study both the majority and Muslim perceptions of each other. There is much survey work done on Muslims that doesn't study the majority population or ask them the same questions. The problem with that is that then the Muslims are already different, and you have to assume what the basis of their difference is. Only by taking both groups can you actually show to what extent they are similar or different. As I said before, Muslims, I want to get away from just having this lumpen category. Unfortunately, we have to stay a little bit in that direction, but to avoid reification, the samples are built in the 4 countries. There are samples of Muslims from 4 countries of national origin, so former Yugoslavia, Pakistan, Morocco, and Turkey. So we have those 4 groups in each of the countries, and we compare the views on the rights for. Another form of comparison is to not just ask them about Islam, but also to ask them about extending rights to Christianity. So that allows another form of comparison and another way of measuring to what extent they view Islam as being different than another religion. And there's sort of an argument within the whole project about this, but this is my position. We study variations between groups within the countries, because from my perspective, the differences between the countries are so much that you have to study variation within a country, because across the countries the scales are not equivalent. I think that's also a criticism that could be made at a lot of the survey material done on Muslims that have like large N's across different countries. Because if you're talking to a person in France where anybody trying to wear a headscarf in a school would be physically dragged out, or you can't go on jury service wearing a headscarf, or there's even talk about banning it in public cities now. that's a very different situation than where, if you're living in the Netherlands and the UK, where you might be sat in class where that's perfectly normal, yeah, if you grow. So simply to pretend that you can measure across countries is, in my view, problematic. So, getting to the business. The questions on Muslim group rights. First of all, I'm only going to talk about two of the questions, show the findings on two. Those on the middle one go in the same direction. But the first is, should mosques with minarets be allowed? Yeah. So obviously we have a lot of churches, we have church spires, this kind of thing. So should it be allowed to build mosques that are in the public visible domain, that have symbols of Islam on them and may have loud calls to prayer? So should that be allowed? Been very controversial. The next one is about obviously schools are important because it's where, in Europe we have national curricula. It's where you're supposed to learn your values to be a good citizen and all that kind of thing. So, schools are important ways for people to become part of society and learn the core democratic values, all those kind of things. So should teachers in state schools or public schools be banned from wearing clothing with these kind of symbols, which, crucifix or headscarf? I'm not going to discuss that question. But this other one, which is, if you like, the more extreme form, is should public schools offer Christian or Islamic religious education for those who want it? So if you want to know about the methods, there's a CATE survey in 2011. It's a very, very detailed questionnaire, more than an hour. Have 6 countries, I'm only talking about 4 here. 4 Muslim groups, as I said, former Yugoslavia, Pakistani, Moroccan and Turkey, plus a majority group in each country as well. Sample sizes, the majority sample was just randomly selected, the Muslim sample by telephones. Now, respondents were included if a respondent or one of their parents were Muslim and from one of the 4 countries. And another important factor, respondents were allowed to answer in their preferred language across the range of languages that were actually allowed. There are many survey researches in Europe that try and test integration by only asking people in English or German or French, which of course then excludes a lot of people who you actually want to talk to. I won't go into this too much, but we did a 2-way analysis of covariance using ANCOVA. Important point that the findings presented here are controlled for age, educational level and income, and also gender is accounted for as well. And the tables show adjusted means. So we look at the significance level. I will describe this when we actually now come on to the 2 tables I'm going to give findings from. So question 1, minarets on the skyline. Several aspects of state-religion relations have recently been under discussion in the country. Do you agree or disagree with the followings? The construction of mosques with minarets should be allowed on territory. And the responses are agree strongly, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Some background research on the policy context of what actually happens. Well, there are proportion of population. You do have mosques in Britain and the Netherlands. There's been a recent change in Germany, whereas in France you have 15 mosques for 4.5 million Muslims. So that, again, gives you an indicator that it's quite different. So the first question then, should minarets be allowed? So first of all, what does this table show? It's always important to know that. The scale then is 1 to 4, and what's shown here are the adjusted means for the different things. Now, a mean above 2.5 and rising to 4 indicates a group's increasing disagreement with the proposition. A mean below 2.5 dropping to 1 indicates a group's increasing agreement with the proposition. So in the columns we obviously have the countries, and in the rows we have the different groups and then their positions. So 2.5 is kind of the middle, and then going above 2.5 is becoming oppositional, and below is becoming more in favor of an extension of group rights. So the majority, well, that's obviously the majority control sample. And then here we have the four different groups of people who are Muslim from their different countries of origin. And obviously here what we've done is put that as 0.01. It's very highly statistically relevant differences of the Muslims from the majority position there. Yeah, the Muslim category here is an aggregate of these four. So, and then the gap is the plus figure shows how much the Muslims are more in favor than the majority over the particular group right. So what the table shows, it doesn't show obviously all the findings because they have been the greatest. It shows the findings between majority population and the four groups of Muslims rather than the differences between the Muslims. So let me demonstrate some of the findings. Well, of course, the first one is very clear that the position of all of the four groups is very highly significantly different than the mean of the majority. So that does find evidence for a gap, and the differences between majority and Muslim groups are larger than differences between the four groups. But nonetheless, you do see pattern differences within the groups, so that in each country, for example, the former Yugoslavians are closer to the native population than everything else. So it's not also the case that all Muslims are the same. Yeah? Now, if we take this figure of the aggregate Muslim position, we can see that Muslims agree, if you like, that minarets should be allowed in all countries, and they agree with this proposition more strongly in France and Germany, the two countries that are more restrictive towards this, whereas that's less so in the countries where it is accommodated. Another point to make refers to the position of the majorities. In the Netherlands, France and Germany, they're roughly around 2.5, which is neither in favor, neither against. Whereas we have quite a strange finding in the UK, the public are strongly against. Yeah? And remember that the UK is accommodating at policy level and has a pacified public debate. Yeah? So what sort of gaps does this produce then? Yeah? Well, in a sense, the more accommodating country, the Netherlands, has the smallest, which we would expect. And then France has a large one, and then Germany's there. But the big surprise is the UK, yeah? But this isn't because the position of UK Muslims is out of line. The large gap is produced by the exceptional opposition of the British majority public. Again, coming back to the idea that we also, if we want to understand gaps, have to study the majority population as well. Now, the final question then, and then I'll wrap up because I've been talking probably for too long. Now, several aspects of state-religion relations have recently been under discussion. Do you agree or disagree with the following statements? The first one is that public schools should offer Christian religious education for those who want it. The second is that public schools should offer Muslim religious education for those who want it. It works again in the same way, so I won't explain that. A little bit of background, that this is actually quite a strong demand that isn't facilitated fully in any of the countries. In the UK, it works in some local areas with high density Muslim population. There's some degree of support. The rights, of course, are given for Christians in Germany, Netherlands and Britain, but not in France, where no religion is tolerated. For Muslims, there's a little bit in the UK, a little bit in the Netherlands, a few pilots in Germany, and obviously nothing. It would be complete anathema in France to have Islamic teaching. So then let's talk through the findings. As I said, a mean above 2.5 rising to 4 is disagreement with religious rights. From 2.5 to 1 is, above is disagreement, below is agreement. Now, let's deal with the positions on Christianity first, and then we'll look at the differences when we move down to Islam. Now, first points to make then is about French laïcité. So the French majority position is 2.8. It's very high. So French are against having Christian religious education in their schools. So people in France have learned and digested their laïcité and reproduce it as a position. Yeah. And it's the only group out of all of them, yeah, that are against an extension of group rights for Christians. Even French Muslims are in favor of this. So, yeah, all four French Muslims groups agree with an extension of rights for Christians. Now, first of all, that shows that it's not just some ideological anti-Christianity that's going on, that it's actually more of a pragmatic position that if group rights are given to other religions, the majority one, there's more chance of them being extended to ours. Yeah. Now, this exceptional position of the French majority is what actually produces the large gap between Muslims and majorities, whereas elsewhere the gap isn't actually very great. But also, you know, again, Muslims are actually more in favor of religious rights for Christians than the majority population. And the means, so the means of the Muslims favor this in each of the countries. Yeah. Now, what happens then when we move from talking about religious rights for Christians to talking about religious rights for Muslims? Well, in the first case, it was only in France that there were strongly significant differences between the majority and the four groups of Muslims, and that was because of the position of the French majority. When we come to talking about Islam, we yet again find very strong differences between all groups of all four groups who are Muslims and the majority population. Yeah, so with the exception of former Yugoslavians in the Netherlands. And what this does is it produces, you know, large gaps. And where does this gap come from then? It comes from the shift in position of the majority population as the topic is provision for Muslims rather than Christians. Yeah. So in each case, the position of the majority population becomes more against that. And this is especially the case in Britain and Germany, the two countries that prioritize Christianity over all other religions. You know, it's a shift of 0.6. Yeah. Now, if you look at the position of Muslims in their views on the extension of rights for themselves, they're actually the same, virtually the same, as they are for Christianity. So they look for an extension of group rights. And that was the same also in the previous question that I haven't told you. The findings are exactly the same. The only slight difference is in the UK, where Muslims become more in favor. So in the UK, you get a polarization of opinion on that. So that again, in the country with the pacified public debates and policies in favor, you see a polarization over these issues. Now overall then, looking at the gaps over these issues, it again sort of fits the pattern that you would expect, with to the degree that the Netherlands is quite accommodating. It has the smallest gap. So that's kind of been learned by the people. France is the greatest gap. You know, it goes from up to 3, which is a really high position of being against rights for Muslims. And then Germany somewhere in between. But the great exception is the UK. yeah, which it has the most it has accommodating policies, has a public debate that says, you know, group rights of Muslims are good for you at the elite level. But then you see this kind of polarization of what's going on. Let me sum up the findings then, yeah? So first of all, there's significant gaps everywhere between majorities and Muslims. Regardless of the degree to which states have accommodated Islam, the gap between Muslims and non-Muslim opinions was highly significant in all 4 countries. By comparison, there are a few differences between the 4 Muslim groups. The gap holds and is significant for all of them in all countries. But there are nonetheless some consistent patterns of differences internally within the Muslim groups, for example, with the Yugoslavians being closer to the natives. But overall, these are relatively minor compared to the gap with the majority population. So to this qualified degree, there is a clear boundary still between Muslims and non-Muslims everywhere. So in everyday life, Muslims and non-Muslims seem no closer to consensus over the fair limits of accommodation in any of the countries. Now, Muslims tend to support state provisions for the majority Christian and their own religion to the same degree. This is most likely because Muslims see better opportunities to advance their own group rights through a context that supports all religious group rights. By contrast, the majority population tend to support state provision for Christian group rights substantially more than for Islam. And it's changes in the majority group's opinions turning against group rights as they move from Christianity to Islam that drives the relationship and results in this big gap, right? So our findings indicate that majority opinions matter a great deal in determining the potential for controversy over Muslim group rights and that they ought to be included in future surveys. With regard to cross-national variations, the majority populations in the Netherlands and France, the 2 countries that treat all religions relatively the same, though in different ways, with the Netherlands being open and France restrictive, have smaller gaps in their opinions on provision for Christian versus Islamic religion. Conversely, in the 2 countries that privilege Christianity, the UK and Germany, again in different ways, the majorities differ strongly, favouring Christian over Islamic provision. So, the findings then are not fully clear. Overall, the gaps follow the expectations that you expect, with the most accommodating being the Netherlands and then Germany and France. But the UK is a great exception. How do we explain this? Well, it's not a data problem. We've checked the data. And so I kind of came up with a little bit of a working hypothesis at the end of this, and it's that for the UK, in the absence of a mobilized anti-Islamic political actor, there's been a sort of groundswell of resentment has built up among non-Muslim Brits over Muslim group rights. And this is in the context where elites are very much in favour. But without the trigger of an anti-Islamic party on the landscape, the Geert Wilders effect, if you like, though UKIP are doing their best to get there, there is a lot of low-level, undifferentiated resentment that's expressed against Islam and that's manifest in everyday life but largely ignored by political elites and unrepresented. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.